She waved him toward the culty pawnbroker like a chipped cup, and by the count of the last ammunition case, the auction was done. He was only a hull scraper, a squat human with soot dried into the pads of his knuckles, standing chained on a coral platform while 3-meter shock troopers laughed and 800 plasma pikes clacked into her stockpile in his place. She had a citadel to defend, and no shells for the culverins. He had a sister on Earth who would die without medicine. Neither of them, in that moment, understood what she was throwing away. 4 cycles later, when the siege broke early and the water gate opened for a river of pikes she could not stop, the Queen would watch from a listening bell as that same small human came down her causeway alone, with a splintered oar and a face like a shut door. And by the time she counted the corpses, she would understand the ledger had been misread from the first stroke of the pen. This is how a queen learned to read her own inventory. The salt in the air on Marrow Reach tasted of copper, of burned ozone, of engine grease gone cold on stone, and it was 2 rotations before any of that happened. The tidal citadel of Marrow Reach stood on a spike of black coral at the seam of 2 moons, and when both moons pulled at once, the water rose to the 3rd gallery and drowned the lower kitchens. The kitchens had been drowned so often that the cooks had learned to hang the salt cod from copper hooks that would not corrode, and to serve every stew with the small crackle of brine crystals on the tongue. Queen Vesic Thara Ol of the Varin, 3rd of that name and last of a line that had held the coral throne for 1100 cycles, sat on the high step of her council balcony and watched a scraper crew dangle in harness against the underside of her flagship's belly. Her true name was a run of throat clicks the translator flattened to Vesic. She was slender, tall even for a Varin, with a plated crest that ran silver blue from her brow to her spine, and eyes the color of a candle behind rice paper. She had been queen for 9 cycles. She had lost 3 of them to a war she was still losing, and she did not know it yet. Her chancellor, a stout Varin named Oldu, who had served her mother and her mother's mother, cleared his throat behind her. Majesty, I hear you. The culti are docked. I heard the horn. They will not take script. They will not take gold. They will take flesh. She did not turn. Then they will have flesh. Down on the underside of the flagship, one of the harnesses swung, and a small figure in a wet coverall braced a boot against the hull and drove a chipping bar into a barnacle growth the size of a helmet. The barnacle came off in a single clean chunk, and the small figure clipped it to his belt and moved on. He had been at it since before the first bell. His name, according to the manifest Oldu carried in his sleeve pocket, was Reuben Ash, aged 32 Earth years, contracted at the port of Lowbridge for the standard scraper term, native of a river town called Peckham Falls, where winter killed anything that could not hold its heat. The manifest also said, in a smaller line she did not read, that his mother had died in a mill accident when he was 14, that he was the only son, and that his sister Marta was a diabetic. It said nothing about a moon called Broch. It said nothing about 41 days at -60. It said nothing worth reading, and the Queen did not read it. Give them 35, she said. The scrapers, the deck black. We can hire more at the next port. 35 is a large gift, Majesty. 35 is a small price for 600 rounds of tidal blank shell. Give them the men. Oldu bowed and left, and the Queen watched the small human swing on his rope until his shift ended, and she never once thought about his face. Why would she? The Varin had bought human labor for 200 cycles. The humans arrived, worked, died at a rate slightly worse than her own courtiers found tasteful, and were replaced. They were not particularly strong, they were not particularly clever. They ate very little and complained less. They were, in Varin measurement, close to useful and far from important. She had a war to run. Down in the scraper barracks, when the summons came, A squat man in a wet coverall folded his ration card and put it in the tin box at the head of his bunk, next to a photograph he had covered in 3 layers of transparent tape because the sea air ate paper. The photograph was of a girl of 11 with a gap in her front teeth and one hand raised in a wave. The bottom of the photograph, in a careful child's hand, read Peckham Falls, 2nd winter. The date under the girl's smile was 7 years old. The girl in the photograph was Marta Ashe, and she was still alive at the time of writing, and Reuben Ashe intended to keep her that way. 35, the crew boss barked from the door. Names on the board, you and you and you and you. Reuben was the 5th name. He did not argue. He had signed the contract with the standard scraper clause, which included in the fine print transferability at the discretion of the Crown, and he had signed anyway, because the wage was better than any wage a foundry hand from Peckham Falls could get on Earth. The wage was going to a bank on Lowbridge. The bank was going to release the wage in monthly increments to a clinic that would sell his sister a season of insulin. He knew, walking out of the barracks with his kit slung over one shoulder, that this was going to make the wage stop. He knew what that meant. He walked out of the barracks anyway, because there was no version of the ledger in which he did not. The Colty received them on the low pier, with the small ceremony a scrapyard might give a shipment of copper. Colty are tall, hairless, grey-skinned, with 3 long fingers on each hand and a 4th thumb that folds back against the wrist when they are not using it. Their eyes are gold, their voices are high and delicate and always sound slightly amused. They wore layered coats sewn from the hides of small aquatic mammals, and they laughed in short, sharp chirps that the translator did not bother rendering. A tall Colty, with a scar that ran from her lower lip down under her collar, walked the line of 35 humans and prodded ribs with a slender rod and made a small note on a paper wheel. "This one," she said, tapping a very tall human at the front. "Muscle. Set him to the anchor. This one, weak lungs. Set him to the pump. This one." She stopped in front of Reuben. She looked at his shoulders, which were not tall but were built like a barrel. She looked at his hands, which had the wide, flat fingers of a foundry hand who had also, in the off-seasons, done stonework. She looked at his eyes, which did not look away. She wrote something on her paper wheel and moved on. The oar, middle bench, 3rd pull. The Queen was not there for the transfer. The Queen was, at that same hour, in her map room with 3 of her generals, running the tidal projections for the culverins she was about to load with the shells she had just bought. She had a war to win. The map room smelled of chalk and cold candle wax and the seaweed that they burned in the braziers to keep the damp down. She did not think about the pier, and no one at the pier thought about her. The Colty took their 35 humans and their 800 plates of ammunition, and they poled out into the salt lagoons, and the salt lagoons swallowed them. The lagoons were 4 days across at the widest, and 3 at the narrowest, and the pole barges the Colty used were long, low, flat things carved from a single trunk of a swamp tree, whose name the translator refused to render, always saying only Bloodwood. Reuben sat on the 3rd bench from the middle. The oar the Colty handed him was 3 meters long, a shaft of pale ash bound at both ends and in 3 places along its length with hammered iron rings, and it weighed 40 pounds dry. It was not his grandfather's oar. His grandfather's oar was in a shed in Peckham Falls, hanging on 2 nails above the door of the boathouse, blackened from 40 years of river work on the Peckham locks. But the Colty oar was made in the same shape, because there are only so many shapes a long lever wants to be, and Reuben's hands settled on it the way a hand settles on a familiar wrench in the dark. "Stroke," the handler called in Colty, and the translator gave it as a lazy drawl. "Stroke, stroke, stroke." Reuben pulled. On the bench beside him, a man he did not know pulled too. On the bench behind him, another. 32 men to the oars, 3 men on the deck in the scraper coveralls, doing nothing. Reuben marked those 3 with the corner of his eye. One was a big man with a broken nose named Halloran. One was a thin man with rope burns on his neck named Vike. One was a younger man with a shaved head named Court. Court was the one who was not sweating. Reuben noticed. He filed it. He pulled his oar. They rowed until the second moon rose, and then they rowed by moonlight, and then the Colty called a halt at a low island of black stone that hissed steam from vents at the water's edge. There was food, which was mash. There was drink, which was brackish. There was sleep, which was permitted for 4 hours only. Reuben ate. Reuben drank. Reuben lay on his back on the stone and looked up at the 2 moons and counted the 4 Colty handlers who were awake and armed on the deck of the barge, and thought, without any pleasure and without any drama, about the geometry of a fight he did not yet intend to have. He thought about Marta. He thought about the money in the bank on Lowbridge that would run out in 7 weeks now because a transferred scraper drew no wage, because a transferred scraper was property. He thought about the clinic on Earth that would give her 3 months' grace on the insulin and then send a very polite letter. He thought about the letter. He thought about winter in Peckham Falls, and about a child who did not have insulin in a town that was already killing anything that could not hold its heat. He did not cry. He had done his crying at 17 in a mill yard on the day his mother was pulled out of a stamping press. He had not done any since. He rolled over on the black stone and slept for 3 hours and 40 minutes. And when the handler kicked him in the ribs at the change of watch, he stood up and took his oar and pulled. The second day was the same as the first. The third was hotter. On the 4th watch of the 4th day, the Colty handler who was assigned to keep the 3rd bench in stroke stopped calling stroke because the barge had drifted into a slack cove where the current did the work, and the 4 handlers stood on the deck in a loose square and lit small ceremonial pipes and did not watch the benches. Reuben pulled anyway, because if he stopped moving, his shoulders would seize. He watched the 4 pipes. He watched the way the handlers stood, 2 facing water, 2 facing island, all 4 with backs half turned to the benches. He watched Court, the young shaved-head man in the scraper coverall, who was not sweating and who had, on the 3rd night, gone to speak in a low voice with the Colty captain at the stern. Reuben had noted that too. Then the sky ripped. That was the way the Queen would describe it later in her testimony to the Choral Council. The sky ripped. A destroyer skiff dropped out of the second moon's shadow with its jump flare still bleeding, and then 2 more behind it, and then the plasma bloom of the Citadel's northern watchtower going up in a single wet flash, the salt lagoons lit up violet white. Every drop of water in the cove reflected the flash, and for 1 long second, Reuben saw the 4 Colty handlers frozen in outline as if painted on black paper, pipes still at their mouths. Somewhere in the Citadel, a bell began to ring. Somewhere in the Citadel, a queen sat up straight in her map room and said, "That is a full cycle early." Nobody heard her say it. She said it to the maps. On the barge, in the flash, Reuben Ash moved. He was chained at the ankle to the bench. 1 iron ring passed through a staple, 1 shackle of soft, wet iron he had watched being closed with a hammer 4 days ago. In the flash, he understood what he had understood on the 2nd day, which was that the shackle staple was set into wet bloodwood, and that wet bloodwood is soft in one direction and hard in the other, and that a man who had done a foundry apprenticeship knew both which direction and how much force. He rose up on the bench with the oar in both hands, planted the heel of it against the staple, and pulled backward with his hips and thighs the way a man breaks a stubborn drainage pipe out of a wall. The staple came out of the bloodwood with a wet, tearing crack. The nearest handler turned toward the sound. Reuben was already moving. He came off the bench low, so low the second handler did not see him at first, and the oar came around in a horizontal arc that took the nearest handler across the throat with the iron ring on the near end. Colty bones are hollow. It did not so much snap as fold. The handler went sideways over the rail with a small surprised chirp and hit the water and did not come up. The second handler had time to raise a hand and open his mouth. The oar came back the other way. The iron ring on the far end took him under the ear. He also did not stand up again. The third handler had a pistol, one of the small energy sidearms the Colty carried, a flat grey thing with a coiled emitter under the barrel. He drew it. It made the small, warm whine those things make when they charge. He fired. The bolt of hot violet light hit the oar on the downslant, and the oar was 3 meters long, and the wood was wet and cold and dense, and the bolt splashed and slid and burned a black stripe along the shaft, and did not so much as slow it down. Reuben drove the near end of the oar up under the third handler's chin with the full weight of his hips behind it. The handler's head snapped back. The pistol dropped. Reuben caught the pistol with his left hand on the way down and shot the fourth handler through the eye at 3 meters without pausing to aim, and then he stood on the deck with the pistol in one hand and the oar in the other, and the wet stink of ozone in his nose, and the last handler's ceremonial pipe still burning on the boards. The benches, 32 humans deep, stared at him. Silence. Then Halloran, the big man with the broken nose, said very softly, "Jesus, Rube, get your shackles off," Reuben said. His voice was not loud. His voice was the same voice he used to ask for the salt at supper. "Use the staples. Push against the grain. Rube, now." They did. Not all of them. Court, the young shaved-head man in the scraper coverall, did not touch his shackle. Court was looking at Reuben the way a man looks at a fire that has jumped its ring. Reuben marked him. Reuben was already looking past him at the shape of the salt lagoon, and at the shape of the citadel behind it, and at the 800 plated shock troopers he could see now, in the flash of the second destroyer's landing burn, funneling out of the third destroyer and into the citadel's watergate. He put the sidearm through his belt. He shifted the oar to 2 hands. He stepped over the fourth handler's body and looked north. "Halloran," he said. "Yeah, Rube. You know what a pole barge does in a slack cove? Drift us, toward the watergate. Rube, that gate has 800 pikes coming through it." "Yes." Halloran did not answer for a moment. Then he stood up in his shackle hole and reached for the pole. So did 4 other men. The barge began, in a slow, ugly, awkward way, to move toward the citadel. In the listening bell, 4 galleries above the watergate, Queen Vesikthara Ol of the Verin sat with her hands folded very tightly in her lap and watched the situation report scroll up the side of her wall. She had trained since childhood not to let her plated crest ripple in the presence of her generals, and it was rippling now. The Watergate had gone at the second bell. The northern watchtower was slag. The Rex consort Halumai, her cousin, the man to whom she had once considered giving her hand and had chosen instead to exile, was on the causeway with his personal guard, and the personal guard of the Rex consort was 80 pike officers wearing the black and red they had not been permitted to wear since the last civil war. "He is early," she said. "He is on schedule," said the general on her left. His name was Eska. He was blunt. "Our intelligence was late." "How late?" "A full cycle." She thought about that. She was very good at arithmetic under fire. A full cycle meant that her intelligence had been fed a schedule that was 1 cycle behind the true schedule, and that meant her intelligence had been fed. Fed meant a leak. She looked at her generals. She looked at her chancellor, Oldu, who was already very pale. She looked at her intelligence master, Yen, who was not pale at all. She noted that. "Esseka," she said, "give the north wall to the culverins, full stockpile, all 600 rounds." "Yes, Majesty." "Yen." "Majesty." "Stay by me." He stayed by her. Down at the Watergate, the 80 pike officers of the Rex consort had formed a wedge and were driving up the causeway, and behind them the 800 plated shock troopers were funneling 3 abreast into the outer bailey. Varin defenders met them at the first tidewater step and died there in tight little scatters of blue plate. The culverins on the north wall began to speak. They were long-barreled shell throwers, mounted on gimbal, and they fired the tidal blank rounds Vesic had bought at such a price 4 days ago, with a low bass thump, thump, thump. The rounds landed among the shock troopers and blew wet craters and threw pieces of plated body into the tide pools, and the shock troopers did not stop coming because there were 800 of them and 120 defenders on the wall. "Majesty," Eska said low, "we will not hold the outer bailey. I hear you. We will not hold the inner court. I hear you. The reserves are on the north wall. I hear you, Eska." He was quiet a moment. Then he said the thing he did not want to say. "Majesty, we should retreat to the throne cavern and blow the coral stairs." She almost said yes. She was about to say yes. Then Yen, standing at her shoulder, said in a very smooth voice, "The throne cavern is the correct fallback, Majesty. Blow the stairs. Seal the arch." She looked at Yen. She had been queen for 9 cycles. She was not a fool. She had been trained since she could walk to hear the shape of a voice. And Yen had said the correct fallback in the tone of a man who had already told someone else exactly where to be when the queen fell back to it. "Yes," she said, "the throne cavern is the correct fallback." She did not order the coral stairs blown. She did not seal the arch. She stood up. She said, in the tone she used for orders, she meant, "Yen, with me. Eska, hold the balcony. Oldu, the standard." Then she walked out of the listening bell and toward the throne cavern with her intelligence master a half step behind her. And she thought, with the cold, small part of her that had kept her alive through 9 cycles, that if she was going to die today, it was going to be at the hands of someone she had chosen. Down at the Watergate, a pole barge appeared through the mist. The pole barge was, by every measure the Rex consort's forward observer had, absurd. It was low and long and slow, and it carried 32 half-shackled humans and 1 man on the bow with an oar and a Colthi sidearm in his belt. The forward observer, whose name was Veska II of the 9th Blade, and who was very young and very proud of his black and red, laughed at it. He laughed audibly, and his laugh was picked up on the listening bell's audio feed and preserved in the record. "Handlers on a pleasure cruise," Veska II said. "Wave them past." "Sir, they are inside our line of fire." "They are dock workers. Wave them past." The forward observer waved them past. Reuben Ash rowed the pole barge in through the Watergate at half current. He did not look at the forward observer. He did not look at the 80 pike officers wading through the low tide with their pikes at high port. He looked at the coral. He looked at the way the causeway rose in 3 shallow steps toward the outer bailey. He looked at the way the shock troopers had bunched into a funnel 3 abreast to move up the causeway, because coral is slippery and the causeway is narrow, and he had built enough dockwork in his life to see the choke point without being told what it was. Then he stepped off the barge into knee-deep tidewater and walked into the choke point. The forward observer, Veska II of the 9th Blade, saw him coming and did not at first understand. He saw a small human in a wet coverall wading toward a formation of 80 pike officers with a wooden stick. "Stop!" he called, in translated Varin. "Stop, or we—" Reuben Ash did not stop. The nearest pike officer lowered his weapon and thrust. Plasma pikes are 2-meter shafts with a shaped emitter at the business end that produces a bar of shaped ionized gas the color of a bruise. The bar of gas is hot enough to open plate steel like paper. It is a fine weapon. It is a weapon that will melt through Varin armor and through Colthi armor and through most of the polymers used in warship hulls. It has one small vulnerability, which is that ionized gas needs something to ionize, and if the thing it hits is too dense and too cold and too wet to ionize cleanly, the gas rolls off it in a splash of light, and burns a mark. The plasma bar hit the ore on the down slant, and the ore was 3 meters of soaked bloodwood banded with hammered iron, and the plasma splashed and rolled and burned a black stripe along the shaft, and did not, in the small, important way, do anything. The forward observer, Ves Katu of the 9th Blade, saw the plasma splash off a wooden stick, and his mouth opened. He did not close it before the near end of the ore came around and took him in the temple. Silence. It was the first silence. The 80 pike officers of the Rex Consort Halumai stood in the low tide of the causeway of Marrow Reach, and they had all just watched the plasma of a 9th Blade pike splash off a wooden stick. And they had all just watched a small human take the head of their forward observer off with the other end of the same stick. Nobody moved. Water dripped off the ore. The pike on the ground hummed its little dying hum. Then Reuben Ash said, in a voice that was not loud, "Get out of my citadel." He said it in his own language. The Colty sidearm in his belt had a translator patch stitched to the grip. The patch caught the words and pushed them out in Varin, and the Varin came out of the sidearm at the volume Reuben had spoken, which was the volume of a foundry hand asking for the salt. "Get out of my citadel." 2 of the pike officers dropped their pikes and ran. The other 78 stayed. This was, in retrospect, an error. Halloran, the big man with the broken nose, came off the pole barge behind Reuben with a boat hook in each hand. "Rube," he said, "you want left or right?" "Both. Both it is." Later, when the tally clerks of Marrow Reach counted the bodies on the tidal steps, they counted 78 pike officers of the Rex Consort, and they counted 3 humans. The 3 humans were named Vike, Owens, and Terrell. They were shackle-marked, and they had died on the causeway with boat hooks and short lengths of chain in their hands. And the Queen would later order them buried under the coral at the 3rd Gallery with the honor name of the Varin 3rd Grade of Nobility, which is a thing that had never before been done for a human. Owens's mother was still alive in a town called Halpa, Iowa. She received, 6 weeks later, a stipend and a letter, and did not understand a word of the letter because the translator patch on it had failed. She had it framed. In the listening bell that Eska had held on the balcony, the situation report scrolled to a stop. Eska stared at it. "Someone," he said, "read the Watergate to me again." His analyst read it to him again. "Confirm," Eska said, "that the Watergate is holding." "Confirmed, sir." "Confirm that a barge of scrapers is holding the Watergate." "Confirmed." "Confirm the identity of the scraper at the front." There was a pause. The analyst, an older Varin named Ilka, was already pulling the manifest of the last Colty transfer. She was reading it. Then she was reading it again. Then she was doing what an analyst does when she does not believe the file, which was cross-checking the fingerprints against the Imperial database. Then she said, "Sir." "Ilka, sir, the manifest says Reuben Ash, 32 years, contracted hull scraper, native of Peckham Falls, Earth, standard scraper." "Read the cross-check." "Sir, the cross-check says." She swallowed. "Sir, the cross-check says Sergeant Reuben Ash, 32 years, of the Terran Colonial Corps Broch Detachment, discharged for medical, survivor of the Titan Freeze riot, 41 days at -60, sir." "Read that back." "Sir, 41 days at -60. Sir, that is not possible. The theoretical survival for an unaugmented human at -60 is 14 minutes. He was augmented? "Sir, the file says no." "Read the rest." Ilka read the rest. There was more of it than either of them wanted. It was the sort of file that is not written for people to read out loud in the middle of a battle, and Ilka read it out loud in the middle of a battle, and Eska listened, and by the 3rd page his crest had begun to ripple exactly the way the Queen's had rippled in the map room the hour before. "Broch," he said. "Yes, sir." "He was trained in the heavy gravity yards." "Yes, sir. Gravity 1.7 standard." "How long?" 6 years, sir. He was 13 when they took him." 13. Yes, sir. His father owed a company debt. He was given up as service. The company was Marrow Reach Salvage. There was a very long silence in the listening bell. Esker closed his eyes. Esker understood in that moment what Ilka had just told him. Marrow Reach Salvage was a subsidiary of the Varin Crown. Marrow Reach Salvage had 20 years ago, when the treaty with Brock was being negotiated, taken a human boy of 13 from a river town called Peckham Falls, in payment of a foundry debt his father had incurred against a Varin subcontractor, and had raised that boy in the heavy gravity yards of a moon called Broch, and had discharged that boy, at 19, back to Earth, with a medical release and a fatty envelope of hush money and a full military file that had been sealed at the Varin Crown level, so that the boy could go back to his sister and his winter, and be, by every legal measure the Varin used, a private citizen of Earth. And then 13 years later, the Varin Crown had, in ignorance of its own paperwork, hired the same man as a hull scraper, and then, in ignorance of its own paperwork, sold him to the Colty for shells. Ilka, Esker said to you, Sir, get me the Queen. Sir, the Queen is on her way to the throne cavern. Get me the Queen. Ilka picked up the throat channel and called for the Queen. In the corridor between the listening bell and the throne cavern, Queen Vesik Thara Ol of the Varin walked with Yen, her intelligence master, at her shoulder, and the throat channel spoke in her ear, and Ilka read the file to her, and Vesik listened. She did not stop walking. When Ilka got to the line that said Marrow Reach Salvage, she stopped. Yen stopped too. She looked at Yen. Yen was already reaching into the sleeve of his coat. She was very quick, the Queen, and she had been Queen for 9 cycles, and she had been Varin all her life. And Varin have 4 wrist blades under the plating of the left forearm that can be triggered at the thumb crook. She triggered them. Yen had a needle gun halfway out of his sleeve when her wrist blades opened his throat. He did not fall right away. Yen was old. He looked at her with a small, tired disappointment that was not, she noted, surprise. He said in a very thin voice, Halome says, he will make it, painless, if you kneel. Tell Halome, she said, that I am not planning to kneel. Yen died. She stepped over him. She kept walking. She lifted the throat channel to her mouth. Esker, Majesty. How many did I sell to the Colty? 35, Majesty. How many did the Colty list on the pole barge? 32, Majesty. 3 were unaccounted. 3, Majesty. Yen is dead. The names of the 3 unaccounted. There was a pause. Ilka was pulling the manifest again. Then she said, Court, Halloran, Vike. Halloran is with the human on the causeway. Vike is dead on the causeway. Court. Court was the 3rd. Find Court. Yes, Majesty. She did not stop walking. She reached the arch of the throne cavern. She stood in the arch. The throne cavern was carved out of a natural coral chamber under the flagship's berth, and it was 100 meters across and 40 deep. And the tide had come in and gone out of it for 1,100 cycles, and the throne itself was a chair of black coral 3 meters high, with tide water still lapping at its feet. There were 600 Varin nobles in the cavern, in their court plate, standing in a shocked, polite quiet, because the Rex consort Halome had already come in from the far side and was walking up the aisle toward the throne with the 80 pike officers of his personal guard behind him. He was Varin, tall for Varin, with a plated crest that ran silver-black. He wore black and red. He was smiling. He stopped at the foot of the throne and turned. Vesik, he said. He had a light, warm voice. He had had the same voice at 11, when he had first stolen her Book of Hours out of her nursery cupboard, and she had known him then to be a liar and a charmer, and both his parents' favourite, and he had grown up into the liar and the charmer he had always been. And the Queen had exiled him instead of marrying him, and had, on some private ledger she did not admit to herself, always known that this was the day the ledger would come due. Halum A, she said. Cousin, you are late to the party. I was detained. Yen, Yen is dead. He absorbed that. His smile did not go. It shrank just at the corners. I am sorry to hear it. He was useful. He was your creature. He was my creature. He was also a very good chancellor. You could have had him for cheaper. You paid too much. How much did you pay him? Half the treasury of Broch in a numbered account he could not access until you were dead. Half the treasury of Broch is a great deal of money. It is, but it is not the point. The point, cousin, is the throne. Please step aside from the throne. I will make this quick. No. He sighed. He gestured. The 80 pike officers of his personal guard began to advance in tight formation up the aisle. Behind Vesic, in the arch, a small square figure in a wet coverall walked into the throne cavern with a splintered oar in his hands and a colty sidearm in his belt. And behind him came Halloran and 8 scrapers with boat hooks and pipe wrenches, and behind them the bodies of 78 pike officers of the Rex Consort's forward guard lay on the causeway. Halloran was breathing hard. Reuben Ash was not. Halloran turned. He saw Reuben. He laughed. It was a real laugh. It was the laugh of a Verin noble who has for his entire life been raised to believe that a human is at best a cook. "Cousin," Halloran said, still laughing. "Cousin, is this your last line?" "He is not my line," Vesic said. "He is on his own line. He is a scraper. Yes. With a stick. Yes. Cousin, I love you, I do, but this is embarrassing." He turned to his personal guard. "Kill the man in the coverall, then the scrapers, then the queen. In that order. Please." 40 pike officers turned in place and lowered pikes and advanced on Reuben Ash across the tidewater floor of the throne cavern of Marrowreach. Reuben Ash walked into them. He had, at that point, been fighting for 18 minutes. He was bleeding from a cut over his left eye, where a colty rifle butt had opened him at the watergate, and from a burn on his right forearm, where a plasma bolt had grazed him at the outer bailey, and from a puncture on his left calf, where a pike tip had come in on the causeway and gone out again. He was breathing in the slow, deep 2-count Broch had taught him at 14 years old, on a moon at 1.7 gravity. He was not and had never been invincible. He had told Halloran on the causeway, in between 2 swings, "We are not invincible. We bleed, we break, we die. We just make the other guy die faster." He had said it in the flat foundry voice he used for the salt. Halloran had said, "Rube, save your breath." Reuben had saved his breath. He walked into the pike officers. The first pike came in at chest height. He turned sideways and let the plasma bar pass across his ribs, close enough to burn a black stripe on the coverall, and he drove the near end of the oar under the pike officer's chin at the seam of the Verin cuirass, where the plate meets the throat guard, and he found the seam because he had scraped 1,000 Verin cuirasses at dock, and he knew where the seam was without looking. The pike officer folded. The oar came back. The second pike officer took the far end of the oar across the visor and went down. The third fired a pike at head height. Reuben dropped under it. The fourth swung a pike as a club and hit Reuben in the shoulder. Reuben did not, in that moment, do anything artful. Reuben took the hit, stepped in inside the guard, and drove the near end of the oar straight up under the 4th pike officer's ribcage. The oar came out red. Halloran and the scrapers came in on the flanks. Silence in the cavern. It was the second silence. The 600 nobles of the Verin court, in their plate, in the shocked, polite quiet of a court that had never watched a battle from inside, watched a small human at the middle of the aisle of the throne cavern do a thing that they were, in the sense they had been raised to understand the word, not able to look away from. He took a plasma bar across the cheek and did not slow. He took a pike butt in the small of the back and did not slow. He killed a pike officer with the oar, and another, and by the time the count of pike officers on their feet had dropped from 40 to 12, he was bleeding from 6 new places, and there was a stripe of blackened wood down the length of the oar, and the shaft had begun in the last third of its length to split. Halamai stopped smiling. "Stop," he said. The remaining pike officers stopped. Halamai stepped down off the base of the throne. He drew from a scabbard at his hip a Varin dual blade. Dual blades are hand-forged from a shell metal called silver foam, and they are the only thing on Marrow Reach that is more expensive than a tidal blank shell. He held it very well. He had had the same tutor in it as Vesic. He had, at 14, beaten Vesic in a dual-blade tourney and gone home smug for a month. "You," Halamai said to Reuben, "man in the coverall, what is your name?" "Reuben Ash." "Reuben Ash, you are a very impressive scraper." "Thanks." "Reuben Ash, if you drop the stick and step aside from my cousin, I will pay you your body's weight in shell metal, and I will let you and your friends walk out of Marrow Reach unharmed." Reuben Ash considered this. "No thanks," he said. "No." Halamai nodded. It was not, in retrospect, surprise. It was a nod like a man closing an account. He raised the dual blade. He said in Varin, a phrase that was very old and that the translator patch did not bother rendering, because it was a phrase that a Varin noble said to another Varin noble before a duel to the death, and it did not apply. Then he came in. He was fast. The dual blade came in a high line, aimed at Reuben's collarbone. Reuben brought the oar up to parry. Dual blades cut wood. The dual blade cut through the last third of the oar. The last third of the oar fell into the tidewater. Reuben was left with a 2-meter stub of splintered bloodwood, still banded with hammered iron at one end. The court gasped, all 600 at once, and it made a very strange, soft sound, like a wind through paper. Reuben looked at the 2-meter stub. He nodded. He came in. The dual blade came at him again. He took the blow on the iron ring at the near end of the stub, and the ring rang, and the blade slid and did not cut through. He was inside Halamai's guard. He drove the ringed end of the stub into Halamai's belly plate. The belly plate did not break. Halamai stepped back. Reuben stepped with him. Halamai cut for his neck. Reuben ducked under the cut and drove the splintered end of the stub up under Halamai's arm, at the joint of the shoulder, where the plate stops. It went in 3 inches. Halamai made a small surprised noise and swung the dual blade in an underhand cut and caught Reuben across the top of the thigh. It was a good cut. It went into the meat and did not stop until it hit bone. Reuben went down on one knee in the tidewater. The listening bell, 4 galleries above, went absolutely silent. Ilka at the audio bank closed her eyes. Eska said very quietly, "Get up." Reuben Ash did not at that moment know what a listening bell was. He did not know that anyone was watching. He did not know that his file in the Imperial database was still scrolling up Ilka's screen. He knew that his left thigh was open to the bone, and that he was kneeling in 6 inches of tidewater, and that a Varin dual blade was 6 meters from his throat, and coming back for the second cut. He thought about Marta. He thought in the small, careful part of him that always thought this in fights, that if he died here, the letter would go to the clinic, and the clinic would send the polite note, and Marta would go through her insulin, and Marta would die in Peckham Falls in the 5th week of winter, and there would be nothing left. He thought about his grandfather's oar on the 2 nails above the boathouse door. He thought about the way his grandfather had said, when Reuben was 10, when the river had come up and taken the lower field, that a man who did not know how to hold his heat was a man the river would eat. He thought about 41 days at -60 on the plates of Titan. He thought about a boy of 13 in a heavy gravity yard on a moon called Broch, holding a 200-pound wrench overhead for the last 6 seconds of a punishment shift, because his instructor had said, if you drop it, you sleep outside. He thought about how it had been very cold outside. He did not, in the sense his mother would have understood, pray. He decided. He came up off his knee. He came up faster than he should have been able to on a leg that was cut to the bone, and the 2-meter stub of oar came up with him, and Halame's second cut, aimed at his throat, went over his shoulder because Reuben's shoulder was no longer there. Reuben was inside. He drove the splintered end of the stub, both hands, all 40 pounds of himself and his shoulders and his hips behind it, up under Halame's jaw at the seam of the throat guard. The stub went in. It kept going. It came out the back of Halame's helmet. It stopped when the iron ring at the near end hit the underside of the jaw plate. Halame's eyes changed. Then Halame fell over. He fell in the wet, flat way of Varin falls when the spine is severed at the base of the skull. He hit the tidewater with a sound that was the last sound the throne cavern of Marrow-Reach heard for a long moment. He splashed once. He did not splash again. Silence. It was the third silence. The remaining 11 pike officers of the Rex Consort's personal guard set their pikes on the coral floor and knelt. It was not a decision they made together. It was a decision each of them made separately, in the same second, because their lord was dead and their contract was void, and there was a small square human 10 meters from them who had, in the last 4 minutes, killed 12 pike officers, 40 pike officers, 78 pike officers, and the Rex Consort of the Varin with a stick. Reuben Ash sat down in the tidewater. He did it slowly. He did it the way a man sits down at the end of a shift. He put the stub of the oar across his knees. He looked at his left thigh, which was open from the front of the leg to the bone, and he said, in his flat foundry voice, without turning around, "Halloran, yeah, Rube. You got a needle? No, Rube. Get me a needle, and a lighter, and a flask. Rube, we should get me a needle." Halloran got him a needle. It was a Varin field needle taken off a dead pike officer, and it came in a small kit with wire and quarter cord and a curved suture hook. Halloran also got him a lighter from another dead pike officer and a flask of Varin field alcohol from the belt of a third and a strip of clean field cloth. He set them on the coral beside Reuben and stepped back the way a man steps back from something he does not want to watch. Reuben Ash undid his coverall to the hip. He looked at the wound in his thigh. He poured half the flask into it. He did not, in any visible way, react. He picked up the needle. He picked up the wire. He picked up the lighter. He flicked the lighter. The needle went dark blue in the flame. He put the needle to his own leg. The queen watched. She had, in her 9 cycles as queen, seen many Varin die in many ways. She had seen a general take a plasma bolt through the abdomen and go on giving orders for 4 minutes before he fell. She had seen a courtesan open her wrists at the small end of a bad affair. She had never, in 9 cycles, watched a person put a needle through their own femoral meat and pull it out the other side with a piece of steel wire trailing behind. She watched. She did not look away. Reuben Ash did the stitch. Then he did another, then another. It took him 7 stitches. On the last stitch, he closed his eyes for 1 second. He did not make any noise. When he was done, he took the quarter cord, which was a coiled length of resistance wire in a small handle, and he ran it along the line of the stitches, and the smell that came off his leg was the smell of a foundry hand cooking his own meat. "Rube," Halloran said. "Rube, I gotta step outside." "Don't be delicate," Reuben said. "Just plug the hole." Halloran went outside. Reuben Ash closed his coverall to the hip. He wiped the needle on the field cloth. He put the needle in the pocket of the coverall. He set the flask down on the coral. He looked up at Queen Vesic Thara Ol of the Varin. "Ma'am," he said, "Reuben Ash. Ma'am, you have my throne, Reuben Ash." "I don't want your throne, ma'am." "You have my cousin's throne, Reuben Ash." "I don't want that either, ma'am." She stepped down from the arch. She walked in her court plate across the tidewater floor of the throne cavern. Every step of her plate made a small ring on the coral. She stopped 3 meters from him. She did not, in the Varin way, kneel. Varin queens did not kneel, but she inclined the plated crest, which ran silver blue from her brow to her spine, and she inclined it the full angle, which is the angle a Varin gives an equal, and she said in the throne voice, so that 600 nobles heard her, Reuben Ash of Peckham Falls, human holder of the 9th blade, holder of the Broch discipline, holder of the citadel of Marrowreach, I offer you, in the name of the Coral Crown, the Duchy of the Outer Reef, from the 3rd tide to the 6th, in perpetuity. I offer you the Varin honor name Ves Tul Akar, which in your language is Deep Blade of the Shallow Tide. I offer you a wing in this citadel of 10 rooms with a coral bath and a private balcony over the 9th gallery. I offer you a place at my council. I offer you a stipend against the tidal treasury, 5,000 plates of shell metal per luna. Do you accept? Reuben Ash considered this. He considered it, sitting in the tidewater on the coral floor of the throne cavern of Marrowreach, with a stitched thigh and a burn on his forearm, and a stripe of blackened plasma along the wood of a splintered oar. He considered it while the 600 nobles of the Varin court held their breath. He considered it while the last 11 pike officers of the Rex consort knelt in the tidewater. He considered it while, 4 galleries above in the listening bell, Eska gently released the breath he'd been holding for the length of a duel. Then Reuben Ash said, "No thanks, ma'am." Silence. It was the 4th silence. The Queen absorbed it. Her plated crest did not ripple. She had been queen for 9 cycles. She said in the throne voice, "Reuben Ash, what will you accept?" He thought about it. "I need 3 things, ma'am," he said. "If you can spare them, name them. 1, a cup of coffee that has actually seen a bean, not the powder, a real bean ground fresh." Done. 2, a bed that does not smell of brine, a dry bed in a dry room. 1 night. Done. 3, he hesitated. 3, ma'am. I got a sister on Earth, Marta. She's in a town called Peckham Falls. She's got the sugar sickness, diabetes. She needs insulin, and she needs it every day for the rest of her life. My wage was going to her clinic. When you sold me to the Colty, the wage stopped." He looked up at the Queen. "I need that started again. And I need it doubled, and I need it in a lockbox that pays the clinic direct so it don't stop if I die. Because a man in my line of work dies, ma'am, and she can't die too. I need that. That's the 3rd thing." The Queen looked at him. The Queen looked at him for a long time. Then the Queen said, in the throne voice, so that 600 nobles heard her, "Chancellor Oldu, Majesty, the Imperial Treasury will establish, in the name of Marta Ash of Peckham Falls, Earth, a perpetual endowment against the tidal reserves in the amount of 10,000 plates of shell metal per luna, payable to the medical clinic of her town in installments as directed by her, until her natural death, and for a term of 200 cycles thereafter to any lineal descendants. The endowment will be styled the Broch Grant, and it will be locked from the Crown's power to rescind in perpetuity by imperial seal and by council vote, which I will call today. See it done before nightfall." Oldu bowed. He did not question it. "Yes, Majesty." "And, Chancellor?" "Majesty, order the kitchens to grind the last of the ambassador's coffee, which is in the north pantry cupboard behind the sugar loaf. Bring it here, in a cup that is not brine." "Yes, Majesty." She turned back to Reuben Ash. "Reuben Ash," she said, "the duchy is yours whether you take it or not, because the Crown does not have anywhere else to put it. The honor name is yours whether you take it or not, because the court will use it whether you use it or not. The wing is yours whether you take it or not, because I will not house the man who saved Marrowreach in a scraper barracks. Sleep in the wing tonight. Refuse it in the morning if you must. There is one thing." "Yes, ma'am." "The wing has a balcony. The balcony has 3 windows. Reuben Ash's face, for the first time in the day, cracked a small, tired, amused wrinkle at the corner of the mouth. "Ma'am," he said, "with respect, I don't do windows." Silence. It was the fifth silence, and this one was different. The 600 nobles of the Viren court, in their court plate in the throne cavern of Marrowreach, laughed. They laughed in the small, startled way a court laughs when the pressure that has been on the room for the length of a battle breaks. And it broke on a joke about washing windows, and the joke was in a foundry hand's voice from a river town called Peckham Falls that none of them had ever heard of, and all of them, by the end of the year, would have visited in their imaginations. The Queen almost smiled. She did not, quite. She was still Queen. "Then we will board the windows," she said. "Tonight, before the coffee." "Thank you, ma'am." He was helped to his feet by Halloran and by another scraper whose name was Perez, and he was walked out of the throne cavern of Marrowreach with his splintered oar across his shoulder like a foundry hand, carrying a broken shovel home from a bad day. And the 600 nobles of the Viren court parted for him in silence, and every one of them, in the small, careful part of themselves that would remember it forever, bowed the plated crest at the full angle, which is the angle a Viren gives an equal. Behind him, the Queen turned to Eska, who had come down from the balcony with the situation report finally rolled up under his arm. "Eska, Majesty, the traitor." "Court of the Scrapers, Majesty, found on the pole barge. He had a listening bead in his ear on the Rex Consort's frequency. He was passing our shift schedule for 4 days." "Where is he now?" "In the Tidewater cell, Majesty." "Take him to the Colty. Give him back. Tell them he's on the house." "Yes, Majesty." "And Eska." "Majesty." "Ilka on the audio bank." "Yes, Majesty." "Promote her. Yen's chair is empty. Put her in it. Tell her to read files out loud in the middle of battles from now on. It is a habit I want to encourage." "Yes, Majesty." She turned. She looked down at the body of Rex Consort Halamai, who had been her cousin and who had, at 11, stolen her Book of Hours out of her nursery cupboard. She looked at the 2-meter stub of splintered bloodwood that stuck up out of the back of his helmet, and she looked at the small iron ring on the near end of it, and she thought, for the first time in 9 cycles as Queen, that she had truly been very close to dying today. "Eska." "Majesty." "Have the ore recovered, all of it. The near end, the far end, whatever pieces there are. Have them fitted together and mounted." "Yes, Majesty." "Have them mounted above the throne, with a plaque." "What plaque, Majesty?" she thought. "The plaque will say," she said, "in the 4 court languages and in his, 'This is the shape a lever wants to be.' Under it, in smaller script, 'Broch.'" "Yes, Majesty." She walked out of the throne cavern. In the north wing of the citadel of Marrowreach, on a balcony that had once had 3 windows and now had 3 boards, a squat man from a river town on earth sat in a chair with his left leg propped on a cushion and a cup in his hands. The cup was ceramic. The coffee in it was too hot and slightly bitter and smelled faintly of the coal smoke of a foundry yard in a town called Peckham Falls, where winter killed anything that could not hold its heat. He drank it slowly. On a table beside him, a Colty sidearm sat next to a Viren field needle and a small photograph, its transparent tape peeling at the edges, of a girl of 11 with a gap in her front teeth. The photograph was propped against the cup so that the girl faced him. He was, in the small, careful part of him that always kept moving in fights, still thinking about the letter that would now not need to be sent, and about the way winter would, from now on, not kill everything that could not hold its heat in one particular household on the bend of the Peckham River. He thought about his grandfather and the oar on the 2 nails above the boathouse door. He drank his coffee. He watched the second moon come up over the salt lagoons, and it lit the water violet white, the way the destroyer's jump flare had lit it 4 days ago, and he did not, in that moment, think about the destroyer at all. He thought about his sister, He thought about the coffee. He thought about the bed in the next room, which was dry, and about the way the sheets on it had been aired and did not smell of brine. He did not, in that moment, think about anything else. There would be time for the anything else. There would be time for the council seat he did not want, and the duchy he had not accepted, and the honor name he had refused to hear, and the queen who had 4 galleries up in her own chamber, sat down for the first time in a day, and in the small, careful part of her that had been trained since childhood not to let her plated crest ripple, let it ripple. There would be time for all of that. Right now, there was the coffee. Right now, there was the photograph. Right now, there was the second moon coming up over the salt lagoons of Marrow Reach, and a small foundry hand from a river town on Earth holding a cup of coffee that had actually seen a bean on a balcony that no longer had any windows at all. He raised the cup, once, in a small salute to the girl in the photograph. He drank. What a ride! What a fight! The truth of it is this: the strongest thing in the galaxy is not the plasma pike or the coral throne or the tidal culverin. The strongest thing in the galaxy is a small man from a cold river town who has one very small person left in the world to keep alive, and who will pick up whatever lever comes to hand to keep her that way. If this story moved you, leave your like on the way out. It is what keeps stories like this on the air. Share it with anyone who loves a science fiction tale where one human stands against the impossible and wins by being too stubborn to lie down. Subscribe to the channel and tap the bell so the next epic finds you the moment it drops. And tell me in the comments one honest choice. If you were the queen after that battle, would you have hired Reuben Ash to train your army, or would you have paid him 10 times over and put him quietly on the next ship home to his sister? Pick one and tell me why. Keep an eye on the empty places out there. Keep looking up at the stars.